Hi, Michael. Thank you for speaking with us today.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
What inspired you to make this movie?
Well, I first read about the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, I guess it was around 2000, late 1999, in some newspapers I would read online. And I had never heard of Falun Gong or the persecution. And at the time, the rationale that was being given for the persecution was very sort of sketchy. There was no specific reason that was given in the news reports that I was reading as to why they were doing this. It was basically just name-calling against the Falun Gong practitioners. And so I became curious about why this persecution was happening. A couple of years later, I actually started to do the practice of Falun Gong myself, and I started reading the teachings. And after reading the teachings and hearing the propaganda to support the persecution, what that made very clear to me immediately was that this whole thing was based on a foundation of lies. All of the things that they were saying about the persecution and the reasons behind it were not truthful in terms of trying to give excuses as to why they were doing it. And if one reads the teachings of Falun Gong, it's very clear that the propaganda is based on complete lies, which is why one of the first things they did when they started the persecution was to destroy all of the teachings that they could find in China, so that when they started out with this propaganda against Falun Gong to try to justify this persecution, people couldn't have a source to go to where they could read the book and say, well, what the state-controlled media said is not true, because it says right here the exact opposite of what they say about these teachings and these people. So knowing about that, and knowing that there were a lot of people who were suffering, and that a lot of this misinformation was being spread not only through China but around the world, I had a very strong desire to tell people about what was actually happening, because shamefully the Western media hasn't reported much on it, and less as time has gone by, which has given people the false impression that this persecution has been subsiding, which is anything but the truth. People are still suffering at this very moment in large numbers in China. It's just not reported. And people who've seen this movie, people who've done some study about the persecution on their own as well, they have asked me many times, why isn't this on the front page? And well, my understanding of that rationale is that it has to do with greed and either immediate interests in China or potential interests in China. And so business, government, and media, they've all been staying quiet about it. So who's going to tell people about what's going on? Myself and other Falun Gong practitioners around the world have been giving our best efforts to try to inform people, and more people are starting to find out about what's been happening. There are many other people of conscience who've been raising awareness as well. And because my background has been in film and television, mainly as an actor, knowing that the medium is a very powerful communicator, I decided to try to make a film to tell the truth about the situation, tell the truth about the persecution, and that's Sandstorm.
It's difficult for people to understand how such a persecution could happen. Could you discuss some of the reasons behind it?
Well, the persecution itself is based on a propaganda campaign that's founded on lies. To understand why the persecution is happening, it's not a question of understanding or trying to understand what's wrong with Falun Gong, because there isn't anything about Falun Gong that can justify this persecution happening. It's necessary to understand who's doing the persecuting, which is the Chinese Communist regime. With communist governments through history, I mean, they've used numerous methods to maintain their #1 goal, which is always to stay in power. They use violence, they use coercion, they use lies, they use threats. There's a lot of corruption. And their number one tool, from what I've witnessed, is thought control, and that's carried out in numerous different ways. For example, they have completely state-controlled media. The regime owns and controls most of the media. What they don't control, that media knows what they're not supposed to say. They have the most stringent internet blockade in the world, which is shamefully developed with Western technology. And so this system of government uses these methods, and through history, by this point today, they've become extremely corrupt, from the top officials right down to the village level. It's virtually impossible for Chinese regime officials to operate in an honest way, because the system does not work like that. It works on lies and bribes and corruption and coercion and a lot of violence and threats and this kind of thing. So along comes Falun Gong. You have these teachings that are virtually going in the opposite direction. No interest in the government. It's just it's a spiritual practice, a practice that has health benefits. It's based on the principles of truth, compassion, and forbearance, which are the antithesis of what the regime uses to control and manipulate the people. It was clear that the practice was spreading throughout China very, very quickly. Parks were filling up with people doing the exercises in the morning, and the regime actually did 2 separate investigations to try and find something wrong with the practice in order to try to eradicate this group, which was growing bigger than the regime was comfortable with. Both investigations, bizarrely, for a communist regime, came back with no problems. There's no problem with this group of people. So in late 1998, the regime did a survey that indicated to them that between 70 and 100 million Chinese were practicing Falun Gong, including many high-level communist officials. So you have these people who are going quietly away from what the regime is using to manipulate and control people. And with a communist regime, this is something that they just will not allow. People thinking not only in a different way, but in a way that's very different. Whether or not they're against the government or involved in politics is not relevant. It's suddenly a group that they're no longer controlling in the same way, because they're thinking more clearly, more benevolently, more compassionately. They're being honest. Suddenly you have some communist officials who do refuse to lie. They do refuse to bribe. They do refuse to accept bribes. So all of these things are happening in society. And it's, of course, from a general perspective, most people would consider a positive thing. But from the perspective of a government that uses violence, coercion, lies, and manipulation to control the people, this is seen as a threat. So the dictator at that time, Jiang Zemin, he ordered that the practice be eradicated by any and all means. So he pushed forth this persecution, and it was started. It was planned months in advance, unknown to the public, but it was started against the people directly on July 20th, 1999. Even though I read a lot of very detailed accounts, I was hoping to be able to speak with people who had personally been persecuted. And I was able to speak with Zhao Ming, who's a Chinese practitioner who's been living in Ireland for a while. He had gone back home and he was abducted and brutally tortured for a long period of time. He's now back in Ireland. One of the tortures that he suffered was being shocked by multiple electric batons. And so just in order to be able to accurately portray these things, I asked if they were comfortable to discuss what had happened to them, and they were fine. And for example, in the scene in the movie where the practitioner is being shocked with multiple electric batons, she's not making any vocal sounds, and that's based on what Zhao Ming told me, which is that when that happened to him, he couldn't make any noise. And so for the force feeding, someone told me that Lily Lee had been force-fed. And as I was speaking to her and she was sharing with me the specifics of, you know, what that was doing to her, and so these things seem to affect different people differently. Some of them will scream a lot and some of them won't, for example. And she was in a room actually with, she said, about 25 other people who were undergoing the same torture. And as I was speaking with her, it just dawned on me that she would be perfect for the role. So I asked if she would be interested in playing the role, and she said yes. And she did a really great job. And it was interesting because during the shoot, you know, when we were doing the scenes where she was being tortured, I was sort of keeping an eye on her to make sure, I don't know, maybe she wouldn't be remembering back and upset or anything, but at the end of a take, she would be asking everyone else, "Are you okay?" Which was actually quite touching. So she was okay with it. She's fine now. Well, I hope after watching the movie that people will have, at the very least, a basic understanding of the kinds of persecution that are happening to these Falun Gong practitioners in China, and understand that it's real. It's been happening for almost 10 years now. It continues to happen now. And as with the practitioner in the movie, her character is a school teacher, and it's happening to school teachers, it's happening to many senior citizens, it's happening to university students. There have been a couple of infants who've died, housewives. You know, throughout society there's been very focused persecution on some of the top universities, where some of the professors at Tsinghua and certain places have lost their jobs and lost their careers and been persecuted, and students have been kicked out of school and their futures are finished. And for people to understand that this is something that's happening to just everyday people who, contrary to propaganda, don't have some big political scheme to try to take over anything, and that this situation has been and remains very urgent. And if people want to take a step on their own, they can contact their local politicians. They can write letters to the media and ask them, hey, why don't you report on this? So it's essentially to raise awareness.
The movie has had a lot of success at film festivals where it has won 29 awards. Did you expect that it would receive this kind of response?
Actually, no. The festivals and the awards were a complete surprise. When I started writing this movie, I had one particular group of people in mind, and that was the people in China who are doing the actual persecution, particularly the policemen. I wanted to, as Shakespeare said, hold a mirror up to nature, because oftentimes when someone can step back from a situation and see themselves, especially from a third-person perspective, they can often see things much more clearly. And so I was hoping that with this movie, showing a policeman who was obeying rules to persecute people who he knew were innocent. A lot of, I think, the policemen in China are in a situation like that, where they don't want to be doing what they're doing, but if they don't, they'll lose their jobs. Their name will be put into the system in China. It'll be very difficult for them to get work anywhere else. They could be persecuted in certain ways. They could lose any benefits that they may have grown over the years. If they have friends and family, you know, there could be pressure applied to them as well. So it's very, very difficult for them. However, when situations get to a point that's so extreme,